Hey friends! So today I'm going to be reviewing These Hollow Vows by Lexi Ryan. I believe that this was in the July bookish box, and I know I'm a little behind the times, but we had to move, so I've read this for a minute. I just haven't been able to sit down and talk about it. So today I'm really excited to get to tell you a little bit about this fun read. I'm going to start with kind of a brief overview of what the book contains. That way you can know if it's a kind of tale that you think you might like or not. So the book starts with us being introduced to our main character, who's pictured here on the front, named Bree. Her and her sister have been struggling through this really impossible contract with a rather nasty aunt. One day, their hard work isn't quite enough and literally can't pay the bill, and so this aunt decides to sell Bree's sister to the Unseelie Court. Though Bree would rather do anything than interact with any of the Fae, now her only hope is to get into the fairy lands to try and find her sister. The only plot that she can think of is to pretend to be a hopeful suitor for the Seelie prince, Prince Ronan. So she has to struggle with both masking her contempt and her fear while she pretends to make doe eyes at this Fae prince. So I would rate the difficulty for point of view as a 1 out of 5. We always see from Bree's point of view, and it's always in the first person present tense. So that consistency should make it pretty easy to understand the whole way through. So the social element, I would say I would rate that a 3 out of 5. There's an element present that I think is present in a lot of young adult fantasy, and that's this struggle for something greater. Bree hates the Fae and doesn't want to go into their lands, and even more so than that, doesn't want to play nice with any Fae, but she has to do that in order to save her sister. And that's just the start. As you know, her journey progresses, she has to do even more things that she would rather not, but if she doesn't do this, then she can't save her sister. There's another layer of morality that's in this book, which is also what makes me rate this a little higher. And the second theme that goes throughout is trust. Bree is a thief, and with her kind of being this roguelike character, she ends up lying a lot. Since she's kind of been taken advantage of a lot in her life, she also knows lies and manipulation and uses lies and manipulation, so she has to struggle with who does she trust. It's very easy to break trust, but what is worth pushing through when you feel like your trust has been broken? Is there anything that can be done to regain it? How far is too far? Unfortunately for me, that comes into play a lot with romance. As you can see, she's flanked by 2 boys on the cover, and they are both romantic interests. So a lot of that trust is around those 2 boys, and she finds herself liking them, but she doesn't know if she can trust them, and how much is, her heart and how much is her head. So I think both themes are very simple, but since there are 2 of them, I think that makes it a little bit more of a difficult element, so I would rate it at a 3. So for the level of intimacy in the romance, I would probably rate this a 4. The book is kind of romance heavy, as you can see from the cover, and as I kind of already mentioned, there's a bit of a love triangle. Is it still counted as a love triangle if they don't like each other? She's got 2 gentlemen that she thinks she might like, but she doesn't know what her heart wants, and almost worse than that, doesn't know who she can trust. She feels like they're both keeping secrets from her, but trying to decide how harmful those secrets might be or how big those secrets might be. But to get back to intimacy, Bree seems to be experienced enough, and these boys too are Fae, and the Fae are always described as impossibly beautiful. And she recognizes that a few times throughout the book. I would say this book goes a little further than your typical YA. Sure, it doesn't use any anatomical terms, but it is very clear what is happening. Things get about as steamy as you can get without actually describing body parts. There are 2 steamy scenes, but no sex. And there is a 3rd scene where there is sex. And so that's why I rated it a 4. I don't think it was the raunchiest thing ever, but it definitely is not a book that you want to read aloud to anybody younger. So I kind of found it interesting that in this book, the violence is less intense. I've noticed that it seems like violence is less taboo than sexual things. first incident that shows blood is Bree actually uses her blood in order to counteract a magical spell. So initially there's a bit of voluntary bloodletting in order to be able to do that. Though there are several times when Bree is in a very uncomfortable and dangerous situation or even gets injured. The only incident that stood out to me as fairly gruesome was when she sustains an injury on her leg. She's out in the woods and is attacked by a creature, and the way that the injury is described was pretty impactful for me. A very large and deep gash is described, and that just kind of affected me a little more deeply, I guess. The only other gruesome act that comes to mind is a rather swift execution. Weirdly, that didn't affect me quite as much. I don't know if it's because the execution really was very swift, and so it almost seemed painless, just kind of like a turning off of the lights. Two, it might have been helped that it was somebody who was painted as bad guy. I hope that's not TMI. But even with a death and a kind of grievous wound, I still think that both the descriptions of those two things and the other descriptions of injuries are pretty mild, and so I would rate this as a 3 on my little scale of 1 to 5. So now my favorite part, where I get to just blather on my opinion of the book. Probably because it was my first experience with it, I would say that it kind of reminds me of Holly Black's settings. And that's probably just because that was the first place I heard of both the Seelie and Unseelie court, and how one's supposed to be light and dark, and how fairies aren't these nice creatures who grant all your wishes and dreams and full of happy magic, and that they can be kind of nefarious. But ever since picking up those Holly Black books, I've always loved seeing that in other books as well. And so I was really happy to see that in this. I also really appreciate, and again, this was something I first experienced in Holly Black books, but where the main character is not enamored with the Fae and know how terrible they are, because that seems to be another through line for these kind of stories that involve Fae, and that a lot of people think that they're great and that they can solve all your problems. And it takes a perhaps more discerning person, a more knowledgeable person, to know that that's not really the way of things. So that was really fun to see her on her adventure there. I also thought that the book had a good amount of twists and turns. I always appreciate when there is a bit of suspense and surprise behind the books. I know that I'm reading YA, so I probably won't be terribly surprised or caught off guard, but it really annoys me when I'm looking at the solution or the next thing to be unveiled and I know what it's going to be, but it takes forever for that to happen. So I would say it kind of struck that chord in a medium way. It wasn't the most offensive that I've read in that manner, but it also wasn't kind of the cleverest, in that I was totally caught off guard every time, or that the thought never crossed my mind. But again, I'm okay with that. I expect that. I'm reading YA, and I am probably a little older than the YA target demographic. I guess those were my favorite parts of the book. I know I'm not a big fan of romance, and this did have a romantic kind of triangle or V or whatever. But it wasn't that frustrating. I actually liked both of the guys fine enough. Much like Bree, I was still suspicious of them, but I could also see where she might be happy with either of them. In fact, I'm kind of embarrassed to say that I find myself kind of falling prey to the good prince, bad prince trope, as I like to call it. And they don't even have to be princes, but just somebody who's a good boy and somebody who's a bad boy. I feel like I like that more than I should. That's probably just because I like grumps, but I also, everybody likes to be doted on and be told how awesome you are. So it's kind of like the best of both worlds. And of course, this book has that. That also made it more fun for me to read. I definitely had a good time reading this, and I might even reread it again, for those steamy scenes. So if it's too long didn't watch, I would probably rate this book a 3 out of 5 on the maturity scale. There are some points that are more mature, like the romantic explicitness, but otherwise the book is pretty easy to read and fine for more levels of maturity. I feel like it would really help you enjoy this book if you were interested in guys. It might not be appealing otherwise, because there is a very heavy emphasis on just how attractive the two guys are, and there are a few steamy scenes. It's fun, but I also feel like it's only fun if you like boys. But I would definitely recommend it to my pals that like guys and YA fantasy. I would recommend picking it up if you feel like that applies to you. But that's it. That is my review of These Hollow Vows by Lexi Ryan. I hope that helped you decide if you want to read the book or not, or pass it along to somebody if you were considering that and wanted a refresher about what it's about. I hope that this video finds you well and that I get to see you in the next one. Bye for now.